McDonald's entered Moscow before much of Eastern Europe, and the reasons lie in the peculiar intersection of Cold War diplomacy, corporate persistence, and Soviet politics. The very first discussions about McDonald's in the Soviet Union began in 1976 during the Montreal Olympics. That year, Canada hosted the games, and Soviet officials visited a McDonald's outlet operated by McDonald's Canada. George Cohan, the head of the Canadian subsidiary, seized the opportunity. He invited Soviet dignitaries to see the restaurant's efficiency and food quality. It made an impression. In a system plagued by shortages and long queues, the prospect of a Western company capable of feeding thousands quickly looked remarkable. Cohan became the architect of McDonald's Soviet project. Over the following decade, he worked through endless negotiations with Soviet trade ministries. These were not ordinary business talks. The USSR was essentially a planned economy with no framework for joint ventures of this kind. Every step required political approval. The satellites of Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, were technically more open to Western consumer experiments in the 1980s. But in practice, no government wanted to outpace Moscow in giving space to a symbol of American capitalism. For political legitimacy, the satellites always looked to the center. The Soviet side hesitated for years. Food supply was the main obstacle. A McDonald's restaurant required beef, potatoes, vegetables, buns, dairy products, all of consistent quality and in enormous quantities. The Soviet agricultural system was not designed for this. Cohan's breakthrough came when he proposed a self-contained solution. McDonald's would build its own supply chain inside the USSR. This was not a normal franchise arrangement. It meant creating farms, food processing plants, and distribution systems that operated parallel to the Soviet economy, but staffed by Soviet workers and overseen by Canadian expertise. This was the compromise that eventually worked. In 1988, under the reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika, the government finally approved the deal. The joint venture was signed between McDonald's of Canada and the Moscow City Council. The scale was unprecedented. McDonald's invested in a massive food processing complex outside Moscow that became one of the most modern plants in the Soviet Union. It supplied everything from beef patties to French fries. The symbolic importance of the Moscow location cannot be overstated. The site chosen was Pushkin Square, one of the most visible public spaces in the Soviet capital, not far from the Kremlin. The opening was scheduled for January 31st, 1990. The timing mattered. The Berlin Wall had fallen only weeks earlier, and communist regimes in Eastern Europe were collapsing one by one. Yet McDonald's appeared in Moscow while the USSR still officially existed. It was a demonstration that reform was happening at the very center of the communist system. On opening day, Muscovites lined up by the tens of thousands. Estimates put the crowd at more than 30,000 people. Many waited for hours in freezing temperatures. The restaurant served over 30,000 customers on its first day, setting a company record. For Soviet citizens, the experience was unlike anything they had known. Efficient service, smiling employees, food that was uniform in taste and quality. It was not just about hamburgers. It was about experiencing something symbolic of the outside world that had been closed off for decades. But why Moscow first, rather than Warsaw, Prague, or Budapest? The timeline provides the answer. McDonald's Canada had spent more than a decade negotiating specifically with the Soviet Union, and by the late 1980s, those negotiations bore fruit. In Eastern Europe, political instability delayed comparable projects. In Poland, negotiations with McDonald's did not result in an opening until 1992. In Hungary, McDonald's did open earlier in 1988, but in a single location in Budapest with limited fanfare. It did not carry the same global visibility as Moscow. The order of openings shows the pattern. Budapest, 1988, the first in Eastern Europe, but small scale. Moscow, January 1990, a massive world televised event. Warsaw, 1992, after the communist regime had fallen and Poland was opening to the west. Prague, 1992, after Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution. The Moscow restaurant came before most of Eastern Europe, not because the Soviet Union was easier, but because McDonald's had targeted it for symbolic reasons, invested heavily in infrastructure, and secured political backing from the top. The choice reflected Cold War logic. For McDonald's executives, gaining a foothold in Moscow was a prize greater than commercial profit. The publicity of opening in the capital of the USSR was worth far more than sales in a smaller Eastern European city. It showed that even in the heart of the communist world, American consumer culture could take root. For the Soviet leadership, the decision was also calculated. Gorbachev's reforms were under pressure. Shortages, rationing, and discontent were widespread. Allowing a Western brand into Moscow served as both a political political gesture and a practical experiment. The authorities hoped it would signal openness, modernity, and a willingness to engage with the outside world. Unlike smaller Eastern European states, the Soviet Union could present the deal as its own initiative rather than as a concession forced by unrest. The opening of McDonald's in Moscow is remembered not only for the queues but also for what it represented. It marked a brief moment when East and West seemed to converge. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union itself was gone, but the restaurant remained, serving millions each year. In the end, McDonald's entered Moscow before most of Eastern Europe because the project was pursued relentlessly by McDonald's Canada, because the Soviet Union offered symbolic weight unmatched by its satellites, and because perestroika made it politically possible at a moment when Eastern Europe was still in turmoil. The Golden Arches in Moscow were less about hamburgers than about history. They were the embodiment of an opening at the very center of a system long defined by its resistance to the West.